Good morning, everyone. I'm John Podesta. I'm the president of the Center for American Progress. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning for what I think will be an interesting and certainly informative discussion about the United States' new nuclear security agenda. I also want to thank Senator Casey, who's with us and will speak shortly, and Undersecretary Tauscher, who will be with us in a bit, for taking the time to share their views with us on this important subject. Almost two decades after the end of the Cold War, the dangers of nuclear attack have not diminished, but the dynamics of the nuclear threat have certainly morphed dramatically. To begin to deal with this new nuclear reality, the Obama administration has adopted a comprehensive approach to the continued dangers, nuclear weapons, and nuclear materials posed to the United States and to the global community. In a flurry of activity this month, the Obama administration has embarked on an ambitious nuclear security agenda. Earlier this month, the U.S. and Russia signed a New START treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in our two countries. This step continues efforts initiated by President Ronald Reagan and continued by both Republican and Democratic administrations, and represents the necessary starting point for progress on a broader arms control and nonproliferation agenda. Just a few days before the New START was signed, the Obama administration unveiled a new nuclear posture review that maintains deterrence while reducing the importance of nuclear weapons to U.S. security strategy. This reflects President Obama's insistence that his administration place a high priority on a nuclear strategy that balances the need to protect Americans from attack with aggressive nonproliferation efforts. And although almost a decade has passed since 9/11 brought strong bipartisan recognition to the threat posed by nuclear terrorism, no coordinated global effort existed to combat that danger. But in mid-April, the administration hosted a nuclear security summit that obtained firm commitments to lock down loose nuclear materials from all 47 countries present within 4 years to prevent nuclear terrorism. And I think there is more on the horizon as the administration is preparing for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference in May. Every 5 years, treaty signatories gather for a review conference, a process that, quite frankly, ended in total failure in 2005 as a result of a lack of interest and a lack of strategy by the previous administration. This time, both the New START and the Nuclear Posture Review will provide a necessary boost to this process and demonstrate the concrete efforts the U.S. is making to meet its commitments under the NPT. The administration efforts this spring were also necessary preconditions for, again, in my view, for reining in Iran's nuclear ambitions. Without these steps, the prospect of achieving international cooperation on implementing tough sanctions on Iran would be a distant hope. Now, they're a genuine possibility. In the next few months, focus will turn to Capitol Hill as the Senate takes up the New START treaty, as well as to New York for the convening of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Our program today will feature two important leaders that will be integral to these two efforts, Senator Bob Casey and Undersecretary of State Ellen Tauscher. To open this session, Senator Casey will speak about New START and its importance to U.S. national security. Immediately following Senator Casey's remarks, we'll have a discussion led by American Progress's Rudy DeLeon with former ambassador to the Ukraine and Brookings Fellow Steve Pifer and our own Larry Korb. Then Undersecretary Tauscher will close our event with remarks on the upcoming NPT review conference. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Bob Casey. Excuse me. Senator Casey is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he has taken a key leadership role in addressing the continued nuclear threat. Senator Casey has been a leader on combating nuclear terrorism, and last year he introduced the Nuclear Trafficking Prevention Act, which would establish nuclear trafficking as a crime against humanity and make it easier to prosecute international nuclear traffickers in U.S. courts and strengthen penalties for trafficking nuclear material. If you say nuclear 10 times in 2 paragraphs, you begin to sound like our previous president, and I apologize. Senator Casey has spoken out forcefully in support of the administration's efforts to negotiate a New START treaty And when the treaty is submitted to the Senate in May for ratification, Senator Casey is poised and will be one of the treaty's strongest champions, and he will help steer this treaty through the ratification process in the Senate. It's a pleasure to introduce him and bring him to the podium to explain why the New START Treaty is vital to our national security interests. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podium, Senator Bob Casey.
Well, thanks very much. I'm grateful to be here. John, thank you for your introduction. And I'm always thankful when I can join not only John, but so many others who are here at the Center for American Progress. And he added a special treat when he brought his brother Tony along. That we don't have a chance to catch up, so we were able to. I've known them both for many, many years. I still don't know who's older, but we're not going to get to that today. I did that on purpose, Tony. I want you to know that. No, I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I want to thank the Center for American Progress for hosting this event. And in a particular way, John, I want to thank you for your public service, which stretches back a couple of years, and also for not only your public service with respect to your work in government, but of course your continuing interest in and advocacy on behalf of public policy positions, and the commitment that you and all those who are part of the Center for American Progress family bring to these critically important issues of public policy. So we thank you for that. And I know John has seen the challenges in pushing nuclear arms agreements through the Senate, as well as from the perspective of the White House. He knows these battles well, and we're fortunate to have his counsel on these and many other issues. I'm also honored to be in the presence of so many experts and advocates in the audience and those who will follow me on this podium, or this platform, I should say, for the discussion. And I probably will be out the door long before Undersecretary Tauscher is here, but I just saw her last night for a meeting, and on, I guess it was Wednesday morning, at the State Department for breakfast. And she was very kind to spend that time with me, and we're grateful for her work. And before getting into the policy and the START agreement and what undergirds our policy in that area, I wanted to commend folks I think that we sometimes don't commend enough. The President of the United States for making his commitment on all these issues that we're here to talk about today, but especially today, his courageous leadership on START. Secretary of State Clinton and her work individually and as Secretary of State and the team she's put in place, including Ellen. And finally, the Vice President Biden, who brings not only a passion and a commitment, but fortunately, as is true of the President and the Secretary of State, knowledge about and experience in the United States Senate, which is always very valuable in these complex times we live in. I think you need to be there as long as Senator Biden was there, 36 years, and you just begin to understand how the place works. So that experience will be very valuable. I wanted to start with the historical perspective. This is something, these words, I think I first heard not at the time they were spoken, but literally on an old recording, or a record, I should say. Half the audience won't know what I mean, but we used to have records a long time ago of President Kennedy's, a number of his speeches. And this speech was 1961 at the United Nations. President Kennedy said at the time, and I know you've heard these words, but they're haunting and a good reminder of the challenge we face. He said, and I quote, "Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness," unquote. President Obama recently noted that we are, paradoxically at this time, more vulnerable today to a nuclear terrorist attack than we were during the Cold War. Today's sword of Damocles still hangs by the slenderest of threads, but we have the ability, I believe, and I think we all believe, to prevent this threat by minimizing the access that terrorists would have to nuclear material. This was the central theme of the President's Nuclear Security Summit earlier this month. This was an historic event, and it helped to create a foundation upon which other countries will take up the challenge of nuclear security and take it more seriously, and in turn cooperate with the United States to accomplish the President's goal of securing fissile material in 4 years. We cannot do this alone. In order to confront this most serious threat to U.S. national security, we need to build bonds of trust with nations around the world. And part of building that trust is rebuilding our own credibility on non-proliferation issues. The New START agreement is a very positive step in that direction. It helps us to fulfill our commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a key marker for many potential allies on a range of nuclear security issues. This New START agreement is a renewal of America's commitment to diminishing the threat posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear material. And this is what we're here to talk about today. Almost two decades after the conclusion of the Cold War, the United States and Russia maintain more than 90% of the world's stockpile of 23,000 nuclear weapons. As we all know, each of these weapons has the capacity to destroy a city, each one. A significant nuclear exchange, of course, would destroy all life on the planet. The Cold War is over, and while the relationship between the United States and the Russian Federation has been rocky in recent years, it's not the Soviet Union of old. We work with the Russian Federation on a host of challenging issues. Despite this enhanced relationship, we still maintain huge nuclear stockpiles in both countries, which inherently, I should say, increases the risk of catastrophic accidents, errors, or unauthorized use of those weapons. The New START agreement signed on April the 8th was an important historic achievement. And everyone in this room knows it requires that each country deploy no more than 1,550 strategic warheads, and that each side is limited to 800 land, air, and sea-based missiles, or launchers, I should say. This agreement brings deployed weapons to new lows. It may not have been as ambitious as some would like, but all arms control proponents would agree that the New START agreement is an important kickstart to a process after years of relative dormancy. The key now becomes how we garner support across the country and in the United States Senate. In order for us to get there, we have to answer at least one fundamental question. How does this agreement make America safer? Well, I think in two ways at least. I'm sure you could add to this list, but at least two. First, the agreement provides for predictability, transparency, and stability in the U.S.-Russian nuclear relationship. Former National Nuclear Security Administration Administrator Ambassador Linton Brooks put it best when he said, and I quote, "Transparency leads to predictability, predictability leads to stability," unquote. The opportunity to examine Russian nuclear forces will help limit the surprises, mistrust, or miscalculation that could result from a lack of information. Furthermore, this important bilateral relationship will require increased attention in the coming years as we look to Russia for deeper cooperation on issues as complex as Iran, the nuclear threat posed by Iran, as well as our conflict in Afghanistan. By building trust with regard to our respective nuclear arsenals, progress on these important issues becomes more likely. Second, the START agreement, the follow-on treaty itself, is a clear demonstration that the United States is upholding our disarmament obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which can in turn help secure support from other countries for a strong arms control regime and assistance on other nonproliferation issues. In October, Secretary Clinton said, and I quote, "The nuclear status quo is neither desirable nor sustainable. It gives other countries the motivation or the excuse to pursue their own nuclear options," unquote. The New START agreement is a necessary step in reaffirming U.S. leadership on the nonproliferation issues. Without a clear commitment to our nonproliferation responsibilities through a New START agreement, it will be increasingly difficult for the United States to secure international support. And as we go forward on that kind of cooperation, we have to make sure that we're addressing all of the urgent security issues that are posed by proliferation, as well as those issues that are maybe not proliferation in nature, but of course are grave security risks. Now, I don't think I'm alone in this assessment about the impact and the value and the meaning of the New START agreement. In fact, I think it's instructive to listen to some of our friends who worked in Republican administrations. Just a couple by way of example, and many of you know not only these individuals, but you know what they've said about these issues. George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, for example, have expressed their support for the treaty and even called for further reductions in Russian tactical nuclear capabilities. In an all too rare instance of bipartisanship in this town, they have joined with Sam Nunn and Bill Perry to advocate on these issues over many years, I should add. And we thank them for their service to our country and their continuing contribution to public policy. And of course, more than anything, we thank them for their leadership on these critically important issues. Now, we've heard some criticism from some quarters of the New START treaty, some of which has not been grounded in reality, which is not a dramatic surprise for Washington. We should take this opportunity to walk through some of the charges and then do a little bit of rebuttal for these discussions. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a former senator from New York, once said, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinions, but not his own facts." And I think that admonition is operative here as well. Here are the facts, or at least some of the facts. Plenty more to discuss today, but just a couple. First, this treaty is in no way limits missile defense. General Kevin Chilton, commander of STRATCOM, testified before the House Armed Services Committee on April 14th and said, and I quote, "There is no restriction in START with regard to our missile defense capability," unquote. Now, the treaty does prohibit the conversion of ICBM and SLBM launchers to missile defense launchers. 5 former ICBM silos at Vandenberg Air Base were grandfathered in and were already converted for ground-based interceptors. On April 15th, Lieutenant General Patrick O'Reilly, the director of the Missile Defense Agency, clearly explained that his agency never had any plans to convert additional silos at Vandenberg. It would actually be cheaper and more effective to build entirely new missile fields instead of relying upon conversion. He went on to explain that the same applied to the conversion of submarine-based launchers, which would be a, quote, and these are his words, "very unattractive and extremely expensive option," unquote. He also said, and I quote, "Relative to the recently expired START treaty, the new START treaty actually reduces constraints on the development of this missile defense program," unquote. Now, as was done following the first START agreement, the Russians have issued a unilateral statement regarding missile defense. Not surprised by that. This document is not part of the treaty and therefore not subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. The administration has also issued a unilateral statement that said nothing in the treaty would limit U.S. efforts to develop current or future missile defense systems. So that's one argument that we'll have to deal with more than once. Second, this treaty does not limit conventional prompt global strike. The Defense Department is currently exploring the technologies which would give the President the option to launch a missile anywhere in the world in a short period of time. The treaty in no way prevents the United States from building and deploying conventionally armed ballistic missiles. Third, a reduction in nuclear arms does not leave the United States more vulnerable. In fact, the administration has taken extraordinary steps to ensure that we strengthen the capabilities of our existing stockpile, to ensure that our nuclear weapons infrastructure is second to none. The President has repeatedly said, and I quote, "As long as these weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal," unquote. Safe, secure, and effective. And he has backed up this commitment with a substantial funding request that devotes $7 billion to maintaining our nuclear stockpile and modernizing our nuclear infrastructure. This is a $624 million increase over what Congress approved last year, and will ensure that we can cut deployed weapons without compromising our security. I hope that those who have expressed concern with the safety, security, and effectiveness of the arsenal will join us in an effort to ensure that the President's budget for our arsenal is protected during the appropriations process. See what happens there. Stay tuned. This commitment extends across the administration. In the recently released Nuclear Posture Review, Secretary Gates asked that nearly $5 billion be transferred from the Department of Defense to the Department of Energy over the next several years. This enhanced budget will help to ensure that the United States has a credible modernization plan necessary to sustain our nuclear infrastructure and support, and to support our nation's deterrent. The NPR reports that enhanced confidence in our existing stockpile in turn will allow us to, quote, hedge against future threats without the need for a large non-deployed stockpile, unquote. If the New START agreement were not ratified by the United States of America, I don't believe that will happen, but if it were not ratified, I believe there would be serious consequences. First, we would lose the transparency and predictability in our relationship with Russia that is so important to avoid misunderstandings. Second, and more importantly, rejection of this treaty would injure U.S. efforts to convince countries to take nonproliferation seriously. This would negatively impact our ability to work with others to confront the threat of nuclear terrorism. A perceived loosening of the NPT regime could lead to a cascade chain reaction of countries acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Today, we're dealing with intransigent regimes in Iran and North Korea. These intransigent regimes both are very serious threats to our security as well as to the world. We wouldn't want this threat to multiply with additional nations seeking a nuclear weapons capability. I do not believe, however, that it will come to this. We will achieve ratification of the New START agreement in the United States Senate. Nuclear arms agreements with Moscow have historically drawn upon a deep well of bipartisan support. The first START treaty in 1992 won Senate approval 93-6. The second START treaty in 1996 won the day 87-4, and the Bush administration's short treaty secured the consent of 95 senators. None voted against. There is no reason why this New START agreement should be different. We may have our differences on elements of the treaty when it's presented to the Senate for ratification, but I am confident that we'll be able to come together in common cause, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, to recognize that these agreements are in our national security interests. There will be deliberation, there will be debate, and that's as it should be. But I am confident at the end of the day, at the end of this process, this agreement, in the proud tradition of the Senate, will garner bipartisan support. And I think in the end, substantial bipartisan support. I believe the future, our future, and especially our national security future, is inextricably intertwined with our work on nonproliferation and preventing nuclear terrorism. Every senator, no matter what party you're in, no matter what your obligations are otherwise, every senator has a fundamental obligation and responsibility to protect the American people. We must maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal. There's no question about that. The greatest threat we face right now is from nuclear terrorism, likely to come from a non-state actor. The only way to truly counter nuclear terror is to convince other countries that they have a role to play in locking down fissile material and being ever vigilant in the face of terrorist activity. The New START agreement helps get us there. The New START agreement helps us to rebuild trust with the international community and to keep our promise in our covenant that we made in ratifying the NPT. If we are seen as doing our part, if we are seen as responsible stewards of the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, more nations around the world will join us in this enduring mission. In closing, I want to say that I think I am, and I think many people in this room and around the country who are following these issues, are inspired by the promise of the advent of a new nuclear spring. We're also inspired by the commitment of our President and our Secretary of State and Vice President, as well as others, on all these issues. When we think of that new nuclear spring and the promise that it brings, we're thinking of the New START agreement itself, of course. The Global Nuclear Security Summit just concluded, the Nuclear Posture Review, and next month the NPT Review Conference. I believe that this New START agreement marks a responsible beginning in America's renewed commitment to the NPT, to securing all fissile material within 4 years. It will ultimately help rally international support to confront nuclear terrorism. We've got a lot of work to do. There's no question about that. I started my remarks today by quoting John F. Kennedy. He said later in his administration, in 1963, his speech at American University, a great speech, which we should all reread. Just rereading part of it last night. At one point he says something very practical but very profound about difficult challenges. He said, and I quote, "Our problems are man-made. Therefore they can be solved by man. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again." That's something that inspires us in this discussion, not only of this START agreement, but all the many challenges we face under the umbrella of nuclear security challenges. I'm also reminded as well about another president, about 100 years earlier, Abraham Lincoln. He said a number of things at Gettysburg, and I'm not just mentioning this because it's Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, but that speech, of course, is instructive, even though he thought at the time not many people would little note nor long remember what we say here, but of course we did. Maybe the greatest speech ever in our history. But at Gettysburg, he said something that I think made sense to me for this challenge, whether it's a START agreement or a whole series of these challenges, nuclear terrorism or otherwise. He said, when he talked about what the obligation of the nation was then, in the midst of war, not only to see it through, but also to bring the country together. He said, and I quote, that we're dedicated here to the unfinished work. And he went on to say, to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And then, of course, he introduced that wonderful concept of a new birth of freedom in that same speech. But that reference to, and then actually later in 1865, his second inaugural, he talked about, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. So in both speeches, talking about unfinished work, talking about the task remaining before us, talking about finishing the work we are in. And the same is true of what President Kennedy said on so many occasions, what our obligation is on very difficult issues. And in some ways, when you think of what both those presidents have said and what our president today, President Obama, is saying, is that we have work to do. It is not easy. It is difficult. But in some ways, it's so consistent with, entirely consistent with the American character, not only in our presidents, but in our people. Looking forward, always looking to the future. As Thomas Jefferson said, I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. But always not only looking to the future, but looking to the future in a way that isn't candy-coated or through rose-colored glasses, so to speak. Looking to the future knowing that we create our own future, that when we have to work hard to get there. So let it be said of us, on this issue especially, the question of security and nuclear security, let it be said of us that we kept our promise on nuclear security, that we met the challenges of proliferation, that we met the challenge that confronts us on nuclear terrorism, that we, as Lincoln told us to do a long time ago, we worked on the great task before us and our unfinished business. Thank you very much.
Just want to, the senator has to attend to his Senate business, so he's going to duck out of here. But I just want to thank him for not only the powerful argument for ratification, but giving us all our charge to go get the job done and help you ensure that we've got the votes to ensure that ratification. So, Senator, thank you very much for being here. Let me invite Rudy DeLeon, Larry Korb, and Ambassador Pfeiffer up to the chairs.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Senator Casey, for that opening speech in this morning's program. I'm Rudy DeLeon, the Senior Vice President for National Security Programs here at the Center for American Progress, and so we thank our audience for being here today. We'll do a bit of a Q&A up here, but we also hope that we'll be able to open the floor and take some of your questions as well. And then at the top of the hour or so, we expect Undersecretary Ellen Tauscher of the State Department to be with us and to continue our program. First, on this panel with me this morning are two very distinguished experts on national security and arms control in particular. They need no real introduction, but let me just take a few seconds. Steve Pfeiffer is currently at the Brookings Institute. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. He's had a long career in the Foreign Service. He was the United States Ambassador to the Ukraine. He served on the National Security Council during the Clinton years, where he was the Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia. He was an expert during the long negotiations in the 1980s that produced the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the famous Viktor Karpov, I believe, and the Walk in the Woods, and two administrations, and probably a lot of illustration on how critical patience is in the negotiating process, and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department. Also on our panel is my colleague here, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, Dr. Larry Korb, who has had a long and very distinguished career. He's a vigorous writer, but time at the Council on Foreign Relations, and certainly here at CAP, where he was one of the original founders and as a senior fellow. Also, a very distinctive career in the Department of Defense, where I first crossed paths with Larry when he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Personnel and Readiness. About 40% of the defense budget in terms of responsibility, and clearly one of the senior people at the Pentagon during the Reagan years. They seem like only yesterday, and yet the campaign of 1980 was 30 years ago, and in that decade of the 1980s, the fundamental defense issue, national security discussion, really evolved around arms control. And so here we are in 2010 with the START treaty just completed by President Obama and to be submitted to the Senate for ratification. Within the last month, we've had a major conference here at the Convention Center with leaders from every corner of the world talking about how to control and make safe our societies from nuclear terrorism. The continued discussion on intermediate range tactical nuclear weapons that are deployed principally in Europe but in other locations as well. And then, of course, how to stop the spread, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and launch technologies as well. So it's a very full agenda, and one that I know the two gentlemen who are with us on the panel this morning have extensive thoughts. But I'd like to start with Dr. Korb, Larry Korb. And Larry, give us your perspective on sort of the linkage between START 1, presented by President Reagan, and then the continuation of START 2, now completed by President Obama and about to go to the Senate.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind when talking about Reagan that people, because of sort of the stereotypes that people have about him, that he really never liked nuclear weapons. Back in the 1980 campaign, when he went for the briefing out in Colorado Springs, and they talked to the general there, and he said, well, what will you do if the Soviets launch a few missiles at us? His thing is, well, you blow them off the face of the earth. And he said, isn't there any other answer to that? And, he said, no, that's it. And he wanted to make that a campaign issue, but his advisor said, wait a second, you already got, a lot of people questioning you. You don't want to take on sort of the nuclear priests here. So he basically did not raise it. Then, of course, he had, in 1983, he came up with the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative that Teddy Kennedy called Star Wars. And while one could argue whether, in fact, that, could ever work, one of the most interesting things was he basically was willing to share the technology with the Soviets. He said, I don't want these nuclear weapons, and, if this works, we can do it. He was ready to give up all nuclear weapons at Reykjavik if, in fact, then Secretary Gorbachev was willing to. Secretary Gorbachev said, okay, but on the condition you get rid of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and he said no. He then got the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and would have had a START agreement by the time he left office, but for opposition from his own party, led by Senator Helms. He was trying to get it done, and then, of course, he was not. He had a big battle with the INF. The INF Treaty was an amazing thing because the people who proposed it, people like Richard Perle, thinking the Soviets would never take it, which was 0-0. You take out your intermediate nuclear weapons, we won't put ours in. When the Soviets accepted it, Perle then was against it. And so they had a big battle with the confirmation, for getting the treaty ratified. And then, of course, he couldn't get the START agreement done, which, of course, then was followed on by President Bush after the Cold War ended, and as Senator Casey mentioned, virtually approved unanimously.
Thanks for that. And let me follow up with you, Larry, because you recently wrote and published an article that really talked about these new initiatives coming from the Obama administration enhance both our national security and our moral standing around the world. Elaborate on that for our audience.
Well, I think it's very clear that with the reduction in the new START agreement, we've enhanced our security in a couple of ways. Well, the less weapons that you have, obviously, the less danger that these are going to fall into the wrong hands or that you might use them. But the real key thing is we signed a non-proliferation treaty back in 1970, and we, among the other nuclear powers, agreed that if countries didn't get them, we would reduce ours and actually virtually eliminate them. So by us agreeing to further reductions, we now have had an 80% reduction between us and the Russians now since the end of the Cold War. Then when we go to the NPT review conference, we can tell people, hey, don't just do as, we say, we're actually doing it. And I also think that in the START agreement plus the nuclear posture review, where Obama talked about not using nuclear weapons against people who adhere to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, this I think will improve our ability to lead at the NPT review conference, and it will also, I think, had a great deal to do with the success of the recent summit we had here, where a lot of countries stepped forward to say that they would, put in safeguards with their own nuclear weapons, and in the case of one country actually transferring them to Ukraine, transferring to Russia.
Thank you, Larry. Ambassador Pfeiffer, you've also written recently, President Obama's busy week on nuclear weapons. But Senator Casey talked about how critical this issue of a safe, secure, and effective arsenal would be in the ratification process. So start there for us.
Well, I think one of the arguments that the administration is going to make is that although the New START treaty will bring the limits down 30% below the limits in the 2002 treaty and dramatically below START 1, you're still going to be within the limitations of 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, 700 ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers, and then the 800 limit on deployed and non-deployed systems. Within those limits, you're still going to have a very robust and effective deterrent. And the president's been very clear going back to his speech a year ago in Prague that saying until you reach that point where you can eliminate nuclear weapons, it's going to be very important for the United States to maintain an effective deterrent. And although the Pentagon has not yet said what its force structure after this treaty will be, you can play around with some numbers on the back of the envelope, and it looks not all that different from what we have today. In terms of the numbers of missile launchers, what we will do, or what the United States will do, is it will reach its reductions primarily by taking warheads off of missiles. And under the provisions of the treaty, there will be the provision that allows the Russians to go in and spot check the missiles to make sure, in fact, that the number of warheads on a particular missile are what we declare. So this creates a system where you're actually reducing the number of warheads on missiles. That's good for stability. But it's also going to be a force that, if you're looking at threatening the United States or American allies, is going to be very robust in terms of its deterrent capability. The other point that I think the administration is moving to work on, and you saw it in the budget increase that was proposed for the Department of Energy and the nuclear weapons complex, is making sure that you have the nuclear labs at Sandia, Livermore, and Los Alamos have the funding, have the personnel, so that they can ensure that as long as we depend on nuclear weapons for our deterrent, that those nuclear weapons are reliable, they're safe, and they're secure. And I think what they're trying to do is create the funding so that you have a nuclear weapons complex that allows you to say, should we have small problems in the nuclear inventory, and they have over the last 10 years reportedly recovered small problems, they can fix those problems. But also having the capability that should you discover a major problem, you can fix that as well. And I think that'll actually be good news, because to the extent that you build up that capability, then you reduce the requirement to have spare warheads, non-deployed warheads. And the administration has already said that in the next round of negotiations, as well as talking about tactical nuclear weapons, it wants to talk about how you reduce non-deployed warheads as well.
So, Steve, stick with the topic. It was just a little bit more than 2 years ago that relations between the United States and Russia seemed to be at an all-time low. Clearly, the dialogue has improved and the interaction has improved. So, where do you think U.S.-Russian relations are right now?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a lot better than it was in August, September of 2008, which was probably the low point in U.S.-Russian relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when you looked at the situation then and looked at what Washington was trying to do in terms of influencing Moscow's decision-making during and in the aftermath of the conflict between Russia and Georgia, it was pretty clear that the United States didn't have good levers. And I think one of the things that the Obama administration has sought to do is to change the course of that relationship with the reset that was announced a year ago. And they made a calculated decision here, which is that if you're going to try to change the broader U.S.-Russia relationship, on some issues you have to respond to Russian concerns. And I think one of these questions was on strategic arms reductions, where the Obama administration went back to a traditional approach, limiting not just warheads, but also limiting launchers, an approach that the Russians were familiar with, responding to a Russian concern. I think that the modification or the reconfiguration of missile defense that was announced last September, while it was driven primarily by a new assessment of the Iranian threat, it also probably occurred to people in the administration that this would also be seen as a positive gesture towards Russian concerns. Well, I think those steps were taken not just because they made sense in and of themselves, but also in part it was an investment in a broader relationship in the hopes that by improving the overall relationship, you could then begin to get Russian help on issues of concern to Washington. For example, Afghanistan and Iran. And you have had some progress on Afghanistan. The Russians are now permitting the overflight of lethal military equipment over Russian airspace in ways that save the U.S. Air Force a considerable amount of money. On Iran, I think the jury still is out. But if you look at the way the Russians have talked about Iran, particularly President Medvedev since last September, it's a very different tone from what the Russians were saying 1 or 2 years ago. And I think it creates some hope and expectation that when there's the final discussion at the UN Security Council, the Russians will be more robust in terms of endorsing sanctions on Iran than they would have done a year ago. So I think that's how this investment plays out. So the arms control move, it's not only good for arms control, but it's beginning to yield benefits in the broader relationship as well.
Thank you for that and for that perspective. And I'd just also like to note for our audience that one of our scholars here at the Center for American Progress, Dr. Sam Cherub, has just returned actually yesterday from Moscow, but has just issued a report looking at the reset 1 year later, and clearly his comments track much along with yours. One last question to our experts, and then we'll take some questions from the press and then from the audience, and that is the long-awaited nuclear posture review has been finally released, and it has a different tone and different perspective than some of its predecessors. I'd ask both of you for your comments on the nuclear posture review from the Obama administration. Larry?
Well, I think what's fascinating is this seems to me, at least my experience, the first time a president of the United States from either party has gone over it line by line. In other words, he was really involved in this. And I think what it does is it moves him toward the goal that he talked about in the campaign and in Prague, where he talked about getting rid of nuclear weapons, which again, let me remind you, this is something that the president I had the privilege of working for, Reagan really believed in. And I think what it did was it moved him in that direction. And I think the key thing was where he said that, if you adhere to the NPT and you fulfill all your obligations, we will not target you, which again I think sends the correct signal. But on the other hand, it didn't come out and in sort of just say, well, we're getting rid of nuclear weapons, right now, and we're not going to do anything and do the steps that the ambassador mentioned here to fix up our review. So I do think it was really very, very critical. And remember, you get one kind of bite at the apple in an administration with the posture review. Everybody does one nuclear posture review. So this was his first one. I think he really took ownership of it, and it moved him in the direction that he would like to go.
Steve?
I would endorse that comment. I mean, it seems to me that the nuclear posture review, both in terms of how it talked about policy and the force structure talked about, is moving us in the direction that the president articulated a year ago in April. I guess I had just two other comments that I found very interesting about this. One is the nuclear posture review was released entirely as an unclassified format. That's never happened before. Mm-hmm. And it always led, when you saw, for example, the 2001 version, well, here's the unclassified format. Well, what's in the classified format?
Right.
And there was a lot of speculation that, well, maybe there were some words that were just a little bit different, but might have some very different meaning. So I think that's a positive step. The other point I'd make is when you look at the reaction to the nuclear posture review, it's been criticized by both sides. A lot of my friends and colleagues in the arms control community are unhappy it didn't go far enough. And on the more conservative side, there's a charge that this has gone way too far. And my sense is in Washington, when you're getting criticism from both sides, maybe you've got the answer just about right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Madam Secretary, welcome. We'll take one or two questions from the audience, and then our second keynoter is here, and we want to keep to the schedule. But let's open it up. Let's start with members of the press who are here who might want to ask a question. Sir, please identify yourself.
Alexander Melikishvili, Georgian Service of Voice of America. Thank you for your comments. I have a question with regard to the recently concluded Nuclear Security Summit. What was the rationale behind the decision not to invite the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, to the Nuclear Security Summit, in your opinion? Considering that the discussion had to do with Iranian nuclear issue, surely the discussion would have benefited from the presence of the president of the country wedged between Russia and Iran. Thank you.
Actually, I don't think the Nuclear Security Summit was designed to focus on the Iranian question. I mean, certainly there were conversations on the margins, for example, between the American and Chinese presidents on Iran. But I think the focus of the Nuclear Security Summit was really on the question of how do you secure, consolidate, and eliminate highly enriched uranium and plutonium. I mean, in some way, it's fairly technical. So it was another way of attacking the problem. So the Iran issue, I think, again, it figured on the side margins. But you're really talking about with 40 countries having highly enriched uranium and plutonium, how do you ensure that that stuff stays as secure as possible, doesn't leak out either to other countries or in the nightmare scenario to terrorists?
Yeah, and I think that's a key point because we focused obviously on U.S., Russia, and then the whole question of Iran and North Korea, but people forget there's an awful lot of material all around the world that could easily fall into the wrong hands. And I think the president was right not to try and distract it, to focus. I mean, on countries, people I think were amazed that looked at it. You mean there's, what's it doing down in Latin America? How did it get down there? They've never been in the nuclear, game, if you will.
Any other members of the press wanting to ask a question? Let's take one from our audience.
I think they all want to hear the secretary.
I think so. Well, we're actually 1 minute ahead of schedule. And so I will thank the panelists for their participation this morning, and I will yield back to John Podesta.
Well, to my colleagues, Larry Corbin, Rudy DeLeon, thank you. To Ambassador Pfeiffer, thank you for being here and for your comments. They're terrific. And I think they set the stage for our next speaker. I'd like to now introduce Ellen Tauscher, the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Under the leadership of Undersecretary Tauscher, Secretary Clinton, and President Obama, the United States have pursued, as we have discussed this morning, a multifaceted and comprehensive approach to countering the nuclear threat. A key focus of the administration's approach over the last year has been to bolster the nuclear nonproliferation regime. The Obama administration has clearly demonstrated America's commitment to nuclear disarmament, one of the major pillars of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. As I noted earlier in my opening remarks, from the president's call for countries to work together toward a world free of nuclear weapons 1 year ago in Prague, to the signing of a new START treaty with Russia, to the release of the new nuclear posture review, to the nuclear security summit held in Washington, the administration has clearly demonstrated that the United States is committed to taking the steps necessary to create a world that is safer from the threat of nuclear weapons. All of these actions leave the U.S. in a stronger international position as we approach the NPT review conference. But repairing the damage caused by the previous administration during the last review conference in 2005 will, quite frankly, not be easy. That conference ended in division and acrimony that still lingers today. The May 2010 conference is vital to U.S. and global national security, which is why we're so pleased to have Undersecretary Tauscher here to talk about U.S. objectives for the upcoming conference. Most of you know, but I want to highlight Undersecretary Tauscher's distinguished career before joining the administration. For 13 years, she represented California's 10th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, Ellen became the House's leading expert on the U.S. nuclear program and nuclear strategy. So it was no surprise when she was selected to be the Undersecretary. Before winning a seat in Congress, Undersecretary Tauscher spent 14 years working on Wall Street. She was one of the first women to hold a seat on the New York Stock Exchange and later served as an officer of the American Stock Exchange. Today, we're very pleased to welcome someone who has been a great friend to the Center for American Progress in her current capacity as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Undersecretary Ellen Tauscher.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here at the Center for American Progress among friends and the brothers Podesta, both of whom I know and love. It's great to also follow my friends Rudy DeLeon and Larry Korb and Ambassador Pfeiffer. Thank you very much for your hard work. I want to say that it's great to be here. As everyone knows, the Obama administration has had quite a run this spring. Some are calling it nuclear spring, and if Mary Beth Sheridan is here, yes, we read what you write, Mary Beth. In early April, President Medvedev and President Obama signed the New START Treaty in Prague. The treaty will improve our national security and international stability by limiting the United States' and Russia's nuclear strategic forces. It will promote strategic stability by ensuring transparency and predictability regarding the United States and Russia's strategic nuclear forces over the life of the treaty, and it will advance our nuclear nonproliferation agenda. Earlier in April, the Obama administration issued the Nuclear Posture Review, which set forth a forward-leaning strategy to reduce the roles and numbers of nuclear weapons in the 21st century while ensuring that we maintain a safe, reliable, and effective nuclear deterrent. And just a couple of weeks ago, President Obama hosted 46 world leaders at the Nuclear Security Summit to galvanize world action to prevent vulnerable nuclear material from ending up in the hands of terrorists. And starting next week, we will take another step to make the United States safer, stronger, and more secure at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York. So today I want to talk about three things. First, how this review conference is different from past conferences. Second, I want to define what's possible and what's not. In Washington, that's called lowering expectations. And finally, I want to reaffirm our commitment to upholding and strengthening the cornerstone of the nonproliferation regime, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. As some of you know, our Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, P.J. Crowley, an alumnus of this great institution, announced last week that Secretary Clinton will lead the United States delegation at the RevCon. In 1995, the Clinton administration sent Vice President Gore. In 2000, Secretary Albright led the delegation, but in subsequent years, the head of delegation had been a lower-ranking official. Secretary Clinton's role this year as the head of our delegation demonstrates the importance that President Obama places on revitalizing and reinvigorating the nonproliferation regime. But let me assure you, we are not going to New York with our eyes closed. Our eyes are wide open. The nuclear nonproliferation regime is under great stress and is fraying at the seams. North Korea announced its withdrawal from the NPT in 2003 and subsequently announced it had conducted 2 nuclear tests. Iran poses another challenge to the nuclear nonproliferation regime. Under the guise of a purportedly peaceful nuclear program, Iran has violated its IAEA safeguards and Security Council obligations in pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. This cynical path to a nuclear weapon cannot be allowed to serve as a model for others. Otherwise, it strikes at the very core bargain of the treaty. That is, in exchange for forswearing the pursuit of nuclear weapons, NPT state parties enjoy the right to the benefits of the peaceful use of nuclear energy. The pursuit of that right cannot be used as a convenient cover for the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Lastly, some may try to turn the tables on those committed to a balanced and responsible review conference by arguing that the United States and other nuclear weapon states have not done enough on disarmament. That's not only unfair, it's also untrue. Our record over the past year exposes the hollowness of such claims. There is an entire alphabet soup of success: New START, NPR, the Nuclear Security Summit, and as the President said in Prague last year, we are committed to seeking the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and to negotiating a multilateral, verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty. So, given these challenges to the RevCon, what can we expect? A review conference is held every 5 years to make sure that the treaty's goals are being realized. The NPT constitutes the principal legal barrier to nuclear weapons proliferation. It also provides legitimacy to our efforts to rally the international community against the clear-cut violations of Iran and North Korea. But the review conference is not a silver bullet or an end in and of itself to curb proliferation. Other tools include multilateral and unilateral sanctions, extended deterrence, and other mechanisms like the United Nations Resolution 1540. A final document at the review conference, which can only be achieved with consensus of all 189 nations, and yes, that includes Iran, can be valuable. It can energize our efforts, renew commitments, and provide momentum. In our view, achieving the impossible test of consensus, considering our ongoing stalemate in Iran, should not be the measure of success. As I said, a final document can easily be blocked by the extreme agendas of a few. There are things, though, that we hope to accomplish. First, we want to make clear that the United States is living up to its obligations under the treaty. President Obama has jump-started arms control as a goal and as a process. Everyone in this room has read his speech in Prague last year. Not only is this good for our own security interests, it gives us the leverage to ask more of other states to strengthen the treaty's nonproliferation obligations at the review conference. So we're not going to shy away from claiming credit from taking those steps to point out that we follow through on our NPT obligations. Second, we seek to demonstrate broad consensus in support of strengthening the treaty's nonproliferation pillar. So we will offer more support for the IAEA to obtain the tools and authority it needs to carry on its mission. We will push for universal adherence to the additional protocol. The current Director General, Yukiya Amano, and his predecessor, Mohammed El-Baradei, have said that this is a critical step. The IAEA must be able to provide credible assurances that not only declared nuclear material is under safeguards and is not being diverted for military purposes, but that there is no undeclared fissile material and nuclear weapons activities. We will push to make sure that there are real consequences for those states that choose not to comply with their nonproliferation obligations. We will work to prevent states from cynically violating the treaty and then exercising their withdrawal rights to evade accountability. Finally, we intend to engage in a vigorous and high-level discussion of these issues at the review conference. Some believe that it is critical that we name names when discussing noncompliance. Does anybody not know who we're talking about? That's a tactical decision, but nobody should be mistaken who we are discussing when we raise compliance concerns. We will also address efforts to implement the 1995 resolution on the Middle East, which called for a region free of weapons of mass destruction. Let me underscore that the United States fully supports this resolution. We were one of the original 3 co-sponsors of the resolution in 1995 and helped present it. But the best chance to achieve a WMD-free zone in the Middle East is to reach an agreement on a lasting and just peace in the Middle East. And making progress on a Middle East free of WMD will become much more difficult if Iran continues to recklessly raise concerns in the region and beyond about the nature of its nuclear program. So the United States recognizes the opportunity for practical and realistic measures to make progress on this difficult issue. We have devoted considerable thought and diplomatic consultation in the last year to assess if we can move forward on the basis of common areas of agreement. Those consultations are ongoing. It remains our hope that any possible disagreement on this important subject will not block progress on the other important challenges we face at the review conference. So what does success look like? A review conference that reaffirms the basic bargain at the heart of the treaty and demonstrates broad support for strengthening nonproliferation measures should be considered a success. A draft final document or a streamlined action plan that draws the support of all but a few outliers would meet the definition of success. For those who wish to block consensus or evade accountability for their NPT violations, we can demonstrate that they stand in stark isolation from the rest of the international community. That will be a positive outcome in and of itself. The review conference should not be viewed as an endpoint or a destination in and of itself. It is a means to an end. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty entered into force in 1970 when more than 40 states signed onto the treaty. In the 40 years that have passed, almost 190 states have now become party to this treaty. And it spurred action. On the disarmament front, the United States and Russia have made significant reductions in our nuclear arsenals. Since the height of the Cold War, the United States alone has dismantled more than 13,000 nuclear weapons. The NPT has established a norm that has helped persuade Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and South Africa, and others, to cease pursuing nuclear weapons and to give them up altogether. We have taken steps to secure vulnerable fissile material and to place excess fissile material under IAEA safeguards. We will take more steps over the course of the next 4 years. And we are working with Russia, the IAEA, and others to set up fuel banks so that countries can pursue the peaceful use of nuclear energy, including nuclear power, in a cost-effective manner without the risk of proliferation. Creating conditions for a world without nuclear weapons requires an enormous diplomatic commitment. It's a global challenge and thus a shared responsibility. It is not something that the United States can do alone. That's why President Obama's leadership and Secretary Clinton's attendance and leadership at the review conference are critical to keeping the momentum going as we seek to reinvigorate and renew this nuclear compact. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary.
My pleasure.
It's terrific, and outline an aggressive agenda. I think we're going to start again with the press. Why don't we begin here? Please identify yourself.
Eli Lake, Washington Times. Does the Obama administration want Israel to sign and adopt the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty? And what are you doing if you are trying to do that to achieve that end?
The Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty right now is we're trying to get the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva to begin work on the program of work that was agreed to in a historic way about a year ago by the 6th committee chairman in the CD. Right now there is one country that is blocking it. It is not Israel. But we're hoping that we can come to an agreement very soon for the beginning of the negotiations. We believe that negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty will take at least a couple of years, but it is an important step and one that the president is very much involved in. But the country that is blocking the CD from moving forward is not Israel.
I mean, are you asking Israel to sign it? At some point, do you want Israel to participate in it?
I don't know why you would pick Israel out of anybody. We have made very clear that we want a fissile material cutoff treaty negotiated.
Michelle?
Thanks. Michelle Kellerman with National Public Radio, the other NPR. I want to ask about, there's word now that Ahmadinejad is coming next week. How are you preparing for that? Are you worried that this sort of casts a shadow over the conference itself? And will there be any contacts between you or other American officials and the Iranians?
Well, Iran is a member of the NPT state parties, and I think there is one other head of state coming, the head of state from East Timor. So it was nice to see that Iran is taking the review conference seriously. We hope that it is a good time for us to engage many countries, but I don't expect that we'll be sitting down directly with Iran. Mary Beth.
Thanks. Mary Beth Sheridan from the Washington Post. Glad to see someone still reading the papers. Undersecretary, you mentioned that the U.S. will push to see that there's real consequences for states that choose not to comply with their obligations, non-proliferation obligations. Can you talk a little more about, what kind of consequences the U.S. would be seeking for those countries, and also can you talk about, do you have reasons for optimism that you will be able to get a large majority to sign on to some sort of action plan or something like that? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question, and I think that it's important to highlight that while consensus may be nearly difficult and nearly impossible to achieve because of the characters involved, I think what's very important is what people are for. And it is important that we will make every effort to have clear what we're for, and that there are, we believe, in a supermajority of countries that are for the things that the United States is for, to make sure that we have adherence to NPT obligations. When it comes to the countries that are out of compliance, there is going to be an opportunity both in the opportunity for an agreed statement, but certainly in other things that we're doing and in other meetings that we're doing, an opportunity to talk about compliance. And those countries like Iran and North Korea. As you know, North Korea is no longer a party to the treaty, but Iran is. And countries that have significant numbers of UN security resolutions calling for them to have more transparency, more visibility, and more of a sense of confidence building as to what they're actually doing with their peaceful program. And when they're caught cheating, as Iran has most recently been caught in September with the Gome facility, they have every opportunity at this meeting to make clear what they're doing. I think that what we've been advocating, what President Obama has been advocating, what Secretary Clinton has been advocating, is for Iran to be clear, for Iran to deal with the very clear concerns, both regionally and internationally, as to what they are doing with their program. When they're caught cheating, what is the answer for that? And to become accountable. And this is a good place for Iran to become accountable. It is the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review.
I think we've got time for one more. Anyone? Okay. Again, I want to thank the Undersecretary for really framing what we face in the next several weeks. And I really want to thank her for her leadership in pursuing the agenda and the achievements that have already taken place since you've come into the administration. So it's great to see you here, Ellen, and thank you for all your great work. Thank you.